Hello, this is Troy Harman. I'm going to speak to you today on college units and soldiers at Gettysburg, a different kind of soldier. So we'll look at university and college students, professors, and units that fought in the Civil War with an emphasis on Gettysburg. We're titling this A Different Kind of Soldier. So, how were they different? Well, these college students and professors that fought in the Civil War were sons of the privileged and wealthy. It was $75 tuition annually for Harvard in 1840. That amounts to $1,703 today. At a time when the day laborer made $9 a month, it was a lot of money, so only the wealthy elites could afford to send their sons to college. These college students that turned soldiers were different too in that they were a direct byproduct of the religious denominational splits. The Lutherans, the Presbyterians, Baptists, and Methodists denominations sponsored the colleges and universities of the 1840s. And when those churches split in those 2 decades over religious differences, it caused a lot of upheaval with the colleges. It caused a lot of enrollments to switch north and south based on the universities dividing up on sectionalist differences. There were new colleges created in the South during the 1850s from Southerners pulling their sons out of Northern colleges and creating new Southern colleges like Auburn University, Lynchburg College, University of North Carolina, Virginia, and Mississippi. Enrollment swelled during this period, but it started with the split with the churches. Another difference between the college soldier, professor, and soldiers that surrounded them in the rank and file of the Civil War was that they were representative of the sectional conflict, particularly in economics. The wealthy class in the South were planters. They controlled the economics, they controlled politics, government, and it was they who sent their sons to Southern colleges, and before the sectionalist divide, to Northern colleges as well. In the North, it was the manufacturer class that was rising with the first industrial revolution. It was they who could afford to send their sons to Northern colleges. Emergence of nationalism is a dynamic in the difference of the college soldier versus the soldiers that surrounded them in rank and file of Civil War armies. What do we mean by this? Well, nationalism is a key word for the 19th century. Nationalism came with the rise of constitutional law, rule of law, constitutional governments, human rights, the notion of all men are created equal, and freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, freedom of the press, freedom of religion, life, liberty, and property, life, liberty, pursuit of happiness. That coincided with the first communication transportation revolution that introduced steam to rail, to steamboats, steamships, the building of canals and railroads, took areas that were isolated and connected them, and through communications created the possibility of a strong central government. So nations like Germany and Italy came into existence in 1870-71. Poland tried to become a nation in 1820, apart from Russia. Greece successfully broke away from Turkey and declared their own national status in the late 1830s, early 1840s. Southern Ireland began to declare its Gaelic tradition being different than Northern Ireland. And the United States, in some ways, represents nationalism in that not only were communications stronger connecting regions and eventually across multiple regions, thanks to the railroad and the steamship, canals, and macadamized roads, telegraph. Not only that, but the person that lived as a citizen in a place like Virginia, before the Civil War, they thought of themselves as, when they said they were Virginian, they thought of Virginia as a country. And they thought of the United States as a union that they belonged to, but that their country was Virginia or Georgia or even Pennsylvania or New York. It might be compared today to if you spoke to someone in Holland or France and asked them about the European Economic Union. They would say they belonged to the Union, but they were Dutch and French first. Well, the Civil War changed that in that nationalism was already starting before the war, but the war made it clear that the federal head was first, that it was a strong national government, and that state governments were no longer separate countries. If anyone had ever thought that, that notion was completely dismissed by the end of the Civil War. States were clearly a subhead under the national government. Now, how do colleges and universities reflect this shift? Well, as Southerners created new colleges and universities and bolstered the ranks of their existing ones, and as they tried to increase their industry and they built railroads, there were flashes of what we might call Southern nationalism. In the North, you had nationalism, and by the end of the Civil War, there was not just a regional nationalism, but there was the overarching national presence of the federal government. Okay, and so the colleges played into one side or the other as there were splits in the denominations. Now, how were they different? They were also indoctrinated by the curricula that they studied. So let's look at, let's climb into the minds of these college soldiers. Well, college curriculums involved physics, chemistry, astronomy, earth science, which involved atmosphere, flora and fauna, biology, and geology. Colleges north and south had metaphysics. Physics has to do with material things. Metaphysics has to do more with the mind and with philosophy. And so they studied ontology, which is the nature of being, cosmology, the nature of the universe, and epistemology, the nature of knowledge. They studied mathematics in northern and southern college curricula. This would involve arithmetic, geometry, trigonometry, calculus, and music. And so each of these were part of the family of mathematics. They studied grammar and rhetoric. And when we say rhetoric departments don't exist anymore in modern universities. But in the 19th century, there were rhetoric departments, and it means essentially to persuade. So if you were a professor in rhetoric, you could teach history, the literary arts, and other subjects. It just meant that you taught each of those disciplines and how to persuade in those disciplines. Now, the colleges of the 19th century involved Greek, Hebrew, and Latin as the languages that would be studied. The merger of Greek and Hebrew goes back to the first universities founded in the High Middle Ages, around the year 1100, 1200, right around that time. It was the emergence there of Aristotle's works, which were brought into Europe from Islamic countries, and really out of Toledo, Spain, made its way up into France and then into England. And the idea of studying Aristotle and merging that with Christianity, that really was the beginnings of the university. And at the time of the Civil War, Greek and Hebrew were still married together as languages that would be studied in colleges. Debate was a very big deal. If you were to look at the universities and the newspapers in the communities in which those universities were, you would find that there were appeals to the public to come out and witness a debate on issues of the day. And debate revolved on sic et non, which is Latin for yes and no. Debate involves arguing extremes, one side or the other, and then the truth is somewhere in between. So the yes and no leads to truth somewhere in between. They emphasized ethos, pathos, and logos. Ethos is one's personal credibility. Pathos is the use of emotions to appeal to the audience. And logos is logic or the substantive part of the argument. If you put together your personal credibility, your appeal to the emotions, and you have substance to your argument, you put the three together, the ancient Greeks believed that that brought about a persuasive argument. And so future lawyers would want to study this, but students would debate along those lines. And again, those debates were made public, and people from the community would come into an auditorium on campus and listen to them periodically as students practiced debate. The colleges taught Bell's Letters. Bell's Letters was a very flowery Victorian form of writing with metaphors and allegories and personification. It was an epic poetry, and it was not quick and to the point like journalism today. It was almost a delicious form of writing. They would teach the soldiers, that is, the future soldiers that went to these colleges. They taught them literature. You studied the ancients, of course, Homer, Virgil, Horace, and Ovid. Homer, you looked at the Iliad and the Odyssey. But they also studied some of the modern lake poets, like Robert Southey and Coleridge and Shelley and Byron and Keats. These are called the Romantic poets. And in the United States, there were some burgeoning Romantic poets like Henry David Thoreau and Ralph Waldo Emerson. And we could include Nathaniel Hawthorne and Edgar Allan Poe. And this form of literature, modern and ancient, was taught in northern and southern colleges, particularly in northern colleges where you would see more Romantic poetry. The South certainly taught the ancients, Homer, Virgil, Horace, and Ovid. Now, history was taught in colleges north and south, with an emphasis on the ancient. People of the time of the Civil War saw themselves as inheritors of the Renaissance, which was between 1400 and 1600, which spawned the Enlightenment and the Age of Science. And Renaissance means rebirth. Rebirth of what? Of the classics. Montesquieu, one of the Enlightenment philosophers, came up with the term Middle Ages. From the fall, it began with the fall of Rome in 410 AD, and then Middle Ages ended, it began in 410 AD and then ended in 1400 in the late Middle Ages. Montesquieu called that the Middle Ages because he saw it as a period between ancient classical time period, Rome, and then before that Greece and Egypt, and the period after the Middle Ages as a rebirth or a continuation or a looking back and continuing the tradition of the ancients. So there was a great love for ancient history during the time of the Civil War. I mean, go to Civil War battlefields like Vicksburg or Gettysburg and look at all of the aesthetics on the monuments that point to antiquity, like Pantheon domes and Romanesque archways and Parthenon-looking columns with figures upon them. You'll notice pyramids and obelisks. Look at downtown Washington, D.C. and the Washington Monument, the obelisk there. And if you go to inner cities that have monuments from the 19th century, or if you go to battlefields, you're going to see antiquity everywhere. And a lot of that had to do with the United States perceived themselves, and the colleges perpetuated this notion. The United States perceived themselves as having inherited all the greatest traditions of the West, and we're now carrying the baton for the West. That's how the United States perceived itself, and so it declared its connections, its associations with the best of antiquity to be part of that continuing story. Now, Southern colleges excluded modern history, and the reason is modern history was a stumbling block for Southern institutions. What do I mean by that? Well, modern history would mean going back about 75 years from the time you're teaching. For instance, if you take a university course today on modern history, It's 1945 to the present. And even though there are a number of students that's a long time ago to them, it's still considered in the broad spectrum of history, it's considered modern history. So if you're studying modern history today, you go back to 1945, you're looking at the ramifications of World War II and everything that's occurred from that to this point. Modern history in the 1850s would have been 1776 in the American Revolution and the idea of equal rights of man, and the Bill of Rights, and the French Revolution, which reinforced human rights. All men are created equal was a stumbling block to Southerners who were not acting upon that by continuing the institution of slavery. So modern history was excluded from Southern curricula. So how were these soldiers that fought in the Civil War ranks, that had gone to college, had taught at college, how were they different? All right, let's continue now by becoming more specific about what Northern colleges were like. And Northern colleges became more national in thought and purpose by the 1850s. They were operating on the Humboldt Model. Humboldt Model comes from Wilhelm Humboldt, who founded the University of Berlin in 1810. The model became the prevalent one for how universities and colleges operated all throughout the 19th century. It spread all throughout Europe and into the United States, mainly northern colleges by the 1850s. So what was it? It was a strong emphasis on intensive research and study, and then teaching that intensive research and study, and letting the research itself and the knowledge itself and the academic freedom and freedom of thought itself take the lead in colleges. Now, if we compare and contrast, we find that prior to the Humboldt model, that's not how things were. Colleges prior to the Humboldt model were formally shaping character. So you would send your son to college to learn discipline, to learn to be mature, to have regimented order and structure by joining the equivalent of the ROTCs of the day, which they called cadets. You learned mathematics and you learned the ancient classics. And so school was about shaping character. The Humboldt model changed everything. It was not so much interested. It shaped character, but let me be a little more specific about shaping character and how that shaped what schools looked like before the Humboldt model. You would have to have your hair cut the same length as everybody else in the class. You had to wear a uniform. There were strict demerits if you broke curfew or if you got in a food fight in the cafeteria, that your GPA would be affected, we would say today, by those marks against you by not being in line. So again, everything was about shaping character and fitting into a structure. The Humboldt model was less about that and more about knowledge for knowledge's sake. And one who went to a Humboldt model school imagined themselves to be a world citizen. So they were learning deeper truths that could be passed across national borders. But there was also a national growth aspect to the Humboldt model. I'll give you an example and then I'll compare it to what was going on in Berlin. In the United States today, when the United States is at war, the universities are approached and given contracts to do developmental research to help soldiers out on the front lines. So engineering schools like Stanford University and MIT and Georgia Tech will get grants, will receive contracts from the government to do technological research that helps soldiers fight on the front lines. And then that technology is converted back to the domestic front later on. So the universities become a way to strengthen the federal government. They are a think tank for the federal government. So they promote national growth. Think of the Army War College today in Carlisle and all of the minds that they produce that are strong military minds in the country and give direction for the Pentagon and other places. The Humboldt Model is the first model to suggest that that was the role of colleges, that they were to help to build up the state, to build up the nation, to develop technologies, to develop thought processes. So the Humboldt Model, it really emphasized academic freedom and freedom of thought and of being a world citizen and of researching knowledge for knowledge's sake and of taking that knowledge and helping outside of national boundaries, but also at times directly strengthening the national government in which the college existed. One more point, German became the language for scientific research in northern colleges, replacing the long-held medium of Latin. This is all an extension of the Humboldt model. England replaced German and French language as the official language for scientific research in the 1940s. So how were they different? Well, northern colleges moved away from a Congregationalist Puritan theology and gradually towards a Unitarian, even Transcendentalism theology. The former rigidly emphasized one's predetermined station in life, and it did not allow for a break from the mold. In contrast, the Transcendental movement of Henry David Thoreau and Ralph Waldo Emerson called on an intuitive interpretation of truth. Harvard's a good example of this. They shift from the Puritan theology in the 1800s and their colleges to one that was more of a transcendental thought process. Let's go a little bit deeper into this. It allowed for following the trajectory of Scripture rather than a permanent fixed state. Transcendentalism emphasized a personal truth rooted in individualism, inspired by nature, and sometimes expressed in civil disobedience. The transcendentalist poet, like Emerson, was viewed as a modern-day prophet. Okay, let's focus on the word individualism here for a moment. Individualism is a big 19th century term. It has to do with the toppling of monarchies and the rise of constitutional-based governments, rule of law, human rights, and alongside that came the rise of capitalism, which emphasized self-help, self-improvement, and the self-made man. So individualism is a big theme of the 19th century. But Henry David Thoreau and his Walden Pond talked about a different kind of individualism, and that's the one I want to go into here. It was inspired by nature and sometimes expressed in civil disobedience. Okay, this is part of the subtle shift of thinking in northern colleges as it stems from transcendentalism. It's the idea of conscience, similar to the Quaker inner light idea, in that conscience can sometimes cause one to be civil disobedient against the government because their personal truth runs counter to what is externally imposed on them. Thoreau, for example, refused on one occasion to pay taxes and was put in jail because he didn't agree with what industrialization was doing to nature. And someone had to pay his fine to free him. Later on, Martin Luther King Jr. said that he was inspired by Thoreau's ideas of civil disobedience and used that in the 1960s for the civil rights movement. So that's what was going on in northern colleges. Now, how did that relate specifically to the sectionalist differences between northern and southern colleges? Well, I mentioned a little bit earlier that colleges north and south were sponsored by Presbyterians, Baptists, Methodists, Lutherans, and that those denominations split in the 1840s and 50s. It caused a lot of upheaval in the colleges which they sponsored and kind of a rearranging of the furniture and enrollees pulling out of one section of the country and going to another. Well, the big divide was over the issue of slavery, and they largely argued over the Bible. And Southern theologians would teach at Southern colleges and in pulpits in the South that the Bible included slavery. That is, the Israelites for 400 years were in Egypt before Moses led them out across a Red Sea and into a wilderness, and then 40 years later they crossed the Jordan into a promised land. Southern theologians would emphasize the book of Philemon in the New Testament, where Paul sends Onesimus back into slavery and writes a letter to Philemon to be good to him. Well, the transcendentalist thought process negated the former argument, in that transcendentalism said that if we depend on our conscience, first and foremost, then we know that slavery is wrong. So the emphasis in the Bible should be on scriptures that point towards a trajectory of human freedom. For example, there's a New Testament scripture where Paul writes that as a Christian there is neither Jew nor Gentile, male or female, Greek or Scythian. Scythian would be Russian. In other words, there's equality as a Christian. And so the inner truth, inner light, the conscience that was taught in northern schools said that's the scripture that we should focus on, because that's the scripture that points towards human freedom. And so these were the kind of arguments that were being carried on between the colleges at the time. Now, how were they different? Well, this particular segment, there's some similarities as well as differences, but let's kind of look at both. There were quite a few militias in the 1850s. Colleges were no different. They had what we would call the ROTC today, but these were military units on a college campus. So one of the reasons why you sent your son to college was they gave them regimen. They gave them discipline. They gave them order and structure. They took their energies and put them in constructive ways. They also fulfilled a national purpose at the same time. The founders who wrote the Constitution in 1787 and then debated and argued and so forth into the 1790s, they argued about whether there should be a standing army during peacetime. And they looked back to ancient Rome for an example where a standing army was dangerous, where Marius or Sulla or Julius Caesar or Pompey or Claudius at different times would take the army and use them against the state to become an emperor. And so if you had this large army standing around, it was a weapon for someone charismatic to win over and then to use against the government. So the founders believed that, well, many of them, that the best solution was to keep the army dispersed during peacetime in the form of militias. So in your towns, you drilled on a Sunday afternoon once a month, or on college campuses, it was a more regular thing. And so soldiers were like Minutemen. They could be called up, if they were trained on a regular basis, they could be called up into a broader army if there was a national emergency. So that was a way of keeping an army ready without having them all in one place. And so colleges helped to serve that function. Now, West Point Military Academy was the ultimate example of how these northern and southern colleges would form, particularly the military bent to these colleges. West Point would be the ultimate example. A third of the Army officers that fought at Gettysburg had attended West Point, including Confederate Commanding General Robert E. Lee, who had been its superintendent in 1852. Commanding General George Gordon Meade on the Union side had gone to West Point, and most of the major generals had. Virginia Military Institute is a southern counterpart, if you will, to West Point. And it fits into this broader mural of college students and professors turned soldiers that fought in the Civil War. VMI. And here's a painting of the VMI Cadets at Newmarket in their charge on May 15th, 1864. These are the college students that we're talking about. General Robert Emmett Rhodes graduated from VMI in 1848. He was assistant professor at VMI until 1851. It was his division on July 1st, 1863 at Gettysburg that attacked off of Oak Hill, where the Eternal Peace Light Memorial is today, and attacked Robinson's division of the Union First Corps along Oak Ridge, near Stop 3 on the auto tour there today. The Citadel is another such college that falls within the descriptions that we've given so far. In Charleston, South Carolina, cadets from the Citadel were the first to fire on Fort Sumter, April 12, 1861. They were there at the very beginning of the war. Citadel cadets also fired on the Star of the West, a Union ship resupplying Fort Sumter on January 9th, 1861. This is January now. So, and there they are. They're your college students firing on the Star of the West. The first Lynchburg College, which was founded over the sectional divide and over the churches splitting, they originally had been their enrollment had been part of a college in Uniontown, Pennsylvania, that left when the churches were dividing, and they formed a college in Lynchburg. Lynchburg today is known for colleges. There's Liberty University, University of Lynchburg. There's Randolph-Macon College, Sweetbriar College, Central Virginia Community College, Phillips Business College. But preceding any of those, by a good half century, was the first Lynchburg College, formed for the reasons that we just described as part of a sectionalist divide in the 1850s. And the Lynchburg Republican talked about when the flag was first raised above this new college. Quote, at 4:30, the flag was raised on the flagstaff of the cupola, and as the tricolored stranger gracefully ascended to its place, it was greeted by the corps of cadets of the college with 3 salutes of 17 guns each. And the newspapers would report all of the things that went on with the nearby college. You would go there to hear debates, and you would go to see the militia drill. And here's a picture of J. Ray, Company E, 11th Virginia. The Lynchburg College cadets would become part of Company E, 11th Virginia. And they were in Pickett's charge. Right in front of the copse of trees is where they reached. Here's an unidentified soldier, identified in that we know he was in Company E, Lynchburg Rifles, 11th Virginia. So Company E, 11th Virginia, were Lynchburg College students. And then Company A, 11th Mississippi, fought in the Civil War. Company A, they were known as the University Grays. They went to the University of Mississippi. University Gray's Tiffany stained glass window is located in Ventress Hall. You can see it here. It was put there in 1889. These were the cadets from the University of Mississippi, fought in the 11th Mississippi. So Company A, University Grays, 11th Mississippi, were college students that fought in the Civil War. And we see down in the lower right-hand corner of this reprint article that the Grays were in Pickett's charge and they lost 100% casualties. That's every soldier was wounded, killed, or captured. And here's the monument to the 11th Mississippi that included the Mississippi Grays. It's right in front of the stone wall near the Bryan Barn on Cemetery Ridge, where they made their assault, commonly called Pickett's Charge. Third day of the Battle of Gettysburg, July 3rd, 1863. They lost 100% casualties. And then we move on to the northern colleges. This is a standard read on the 20th Massachusetts by George Bruce. And he writes, the 20th Massachusetts stands fifth on the roll of those that suffered the heaviest losses during the Civil War. It is not unworthy of mention that it was officered largely by young men fresh from Harvard University. For this reason, it was popularly known as the Harvard Regiment. Now we're going to continue to read from Bruce, but take a look to your left there and you can see the Richard Miller book that's highly acclaimed called Harvard's Civil War. This comes very recommended. Now Bruce continued, it was the Harvard officers who gave to it in a great measure its character, though associated with them were some others possessed of the true military spirit. That the Harvard officers constituted a body of men of exceptional ability and character is evident from the high rank attained in service by so many as appears from the following list. And so Bruce gives us a list here. Brevet Major General William Bartlett, George Macy, William Lee, Francis Palfrey, Paul Revere, one of the grandsons of Paul Revere of the Revolution, Charles Pearson, Charles Whittier, Caspar Crowninshield, Edward Hallowell, Arthur Curtis, and Henry Patton. And then we can see on the far left of this photograph, Captain William Francis Bartlett of Harvard College, later a Major General. So Harvard produced high-ranking generals all throughout the ranks of Union armies. And here's another good example of that. Brigadier General Francis Barlow, Harvard College. He studied law and graduated first in his class. He was son of a Unitarian minister. And so if you go to Gettysburg today, just north of town, you can visit Barlow's Knoll that bears his name, and there's a statue there to him. And this is Harvard Square, where the soldiers came out in the historic center of Cambridge, the heart of Harvard University, to enlist. This is Memorial Hall at Harvard University. Hallway is aligned with plaques of Harvard names who served in the Civil War. Look at all of those plaques. And this is a monument to the 20th Massachusetts, the Harvard Regiment, at Gettysburg along Cemetery Ridge, where Pickett's charge was repulsed. It's an unusual looking stone there. It's called Pudding Stone. It's from Roxbury. It was brought to Gettysburg by rail and placed on that pedestal and dedicated by soldiers of the 20th Mass, including Harvard students, former Harvard students. Now, Company G, 11th North Carolina, is addressed in the book here on your left. They were University of North Carolina students. And this book comes highly recommended. William Thomas Venner's The 11th North Carolina Infantry in the Civil War, A History and a Roster. Company G were the University of North Carolina students that are discussed herein. And here are some of the 11th North Carolina officers. The area where they fought was McPherson Ridge on the first day of the battle. They fought against the Iron Brigade. Now, the division commander for that attack between Harris Ridge and McPherson Ridge was Brigadier General James J. Pettigrew, University of North Carolina student, 1847. And Colonel Henry King Burgoyne Jr., 26th North Carolina Infantry, was a student at the University of North Carolina in 1857. He was killed very near where the John Reynolds killed monument is, at Herbst Woods, McPherson Ridge. That would be very near stop 1 on your auto tour. And Colonel Isaac Avery attended the University of North Carolina in 1847. He led the North Carolina portion of the attack against East Cemetery Hill on the evening of July 2nd, 1863. And if you want to visit that spot today, there's a football field there owned by the Gettysburg school system at the base of East Cemetery Hill. And where the grandstand is, there was an orchard there during the battle, It's believed that that's where Colonel Isaac Avery received his mortal wound. And so he was lowered to the ground, and he reached in the dark, and there was a lot of flashes of explosions as the battle was carrying on into the twilight hours. And he found a dingy bit of notepaper, and he scribbled on it, and it's blood-stained. He scribbled, Major Tate, tell my father I died facing the enemy. And Major Tate was in the 6th North Carolina and would find him in the note and preserve it to this day. Isaac Avery attended University of North Carolina in 1847. The 151st Pennsylvania Infantry, many of them were from McAllisterville Academy in Juniata County, Pennsylvania, and they were led by the Academy principal, Lieutenant Colonel George McFarland. And though there were skilled artisans of various trades in the ranks, there were enough teachers in the ranks that they're commonly known as the Teacher Regiment. And they fought at Herbst Woods on the first day of the battle. And that's where their markers are, on McPherson Ridge near Stop 1. They would have gone right up against Colonel Henry King Burgoyne of the University of North Carolina. And then Brown University was represented in the Civil War. And this is from the text that we see on our left, a memorial history of Brown University. And this is a reference to the raising of a flag at Brown University 5 days after Fort Sumter. And it reads, Wednesday, April 17th, 1861, was a day long to be remembered by those who were in the university in 1861. At 5 o'clock in the afternoon of that day, in the presence of the faculty and of the undergraduates of the college, and also of a large throng of citizens of Providence, Rhode Island, the senior class raised the stars and stripes over the University Hall. Here's another memory from Henry S. Barrage's Brown University in the Civil War, a memorial. He writes, To the future historian, whose duty it shall be to analyze the motives which led to such self-sacrifice, nothing but the most unselfish devotion to the interest of the country will be apparent. What else could induce men absorbed in literary pursuits to forego, in the heat of the summer, the subtleties of logic, the intricacies of mathematics, the familiar talks of Thucydides and Demosthenes, and Socrates and Plato, for Rhode Island clam bakes and surf bathing and fishing, and a locality more beautiful than Utopia of Thomas More and Robert Southey. So they sacrificed all of those pleasures of learning and of the beauty all around their campus. They sacrificed that to fight in the Civil War. That's what Barrage is telling us. This is a Civil War tablet at Manning Hall of Brown University. The Latin inscription honors Brown University students and alumni who gave their lives during the Civil War on behalf of liberty and preserving the Union. You can see the long list of names. I've gone through some of these names and looked them up. Lieutenant Thomas Fred Brown commanded Battery B, 1st Artillery, Rhode Island at Gettysburg. A battery is 6 artillery pieces, by the way. He was a student at Brown University and wounded on July 2nd. That's the area of the high water mark today, the copse of trees and the angle. Lieutenant Colonel Charles Bertrand Randall graduated from Brown University in 1852. He took over command of the 149th New York Infantry at Culp's Hill after Colonel Henry A. Barnum was wounded. Randall was wounded on July 3rd. So on July 3rd, he led these troops largely from Syracuse, New York, and you can see this monument for the regiment that he led over on Culp's Hill today. You see the beautiful relief there depicting a scene where the 149th, those Syracuse troops, are behind the log works, and they're firing down the hill at the Confederates who are charging up. And notice in the foreground, a sergeant is repairing a flagstaff. So many Confederate bullets flew into Union lines that it cut the flagstaff in half, and he's trying to splint it back together. Rhode Island Light Artillery B fought in the Peach Orchard on the second day of the battle. And Lieutenant John K. Buckland of Battery E was wounded on July 2nd, receiving the Medal of Honor at Gettysburg. He would later receive the Medal of Honor. He graduated with honors in 1861 with an MA from Brown University and became a teacher. So if you go to the famous Peach Orchard today at Gettysburg, where General Sickles' line advanced to for the fight there, when you go there, look for this battery and remember Brown University. And this is a picture, an artist's depiction of Pennsylvania College, commonly called Gettysburg College, from a corner of the 1858 Adams County map. And yes, they had college cadets that fought in the Civil War, that fought in the battle, in the broader campaign of Gettysburg, we should say. They fought on June the 26th, 1863, 5 days before the main battle. They rushed down Chambersburg Pike, 3 miles west of Gettysburg, and fought on Marsh Creek to resist Jubal Early's Confederate advance on the town 5 days before the main battle. The Confederates would try to come in and get supplies on their way to York, where they were also tearing up railroads and gathering up supplies. Well, they met resistance 3 miles west of Gettysburg from Gettysburg College cadets, Gettysburg College student soldiers. And this photo is from the Special Collections Musselman Library, Gettysburg College. Here's a close-up, and you can see the monument to the Gettysburg College soldier, student soldier. And it's in front of the old Meade School there where Buford Avenue divides from Springs Avenue. And Penn State also had a presence in the Civil War, and specifically at Gettysburg. They were known in the 1850s as the Agricultural College of Pennsylvania, also called the Farmers High School of Pennsylvania, Center County. This is a picture of Old Main, circa 1855, Penn State. And here's a superimposed image of Colonel Edward Cross's brigade marker near the wheat field at Gettysburg, where there was so much bloodshed on the second day of the battle, and where the 148th Pennsylvania, that included Penn State students, fought. And you can see that superimposed with Old Main in the background. Captain Robert M. Forster, Penn State's first postmaster, commanded Company C, 148th Pennsylvania Infantry, with Penn State students. And you can see their names there. This was excerpted from the Pennsylvania Memorial at Gettysburg. The 2nd Virginia in the Southern Army, known as part of the Stonewall Brigade, and Carpenter's Battery that fought on Benner's Hill, where Confederates launched attacks against Culp's Hill, contained a couple Penn State students too. These must have been students that were from the South, had attended a northern college, and then when the sectionalist divide occurred, they went back down south and fought with people from their own communities. So Penn State fought at Gettysburg. Here's the monument to the 148th Pennsylvania that Penn State students were part of. This is on the edge of the wheat field. There were over 5,000 soldiers killed, wounded, or missing there in 2.5 hours. It's the bloodiest 26 acres in American history. Nearly as many casualties in the wheat field in 2.5 hours as Americans died in Iraq in 5 years. And this is The Professor from Maine by Mort Kunstler, Professor Joshua Chamberlain. People from all over the world have read Killer Angels, the historical novel by Shara, which inspired the movie Gettysburg, which has been watched in hundreds of countries. And everyone through these mediums and also through Civil War studies knows about Joshua Chamberlain. Seemingly everyone knows about him. 1.2 million people visit Gettysburg every year, and most of those people go to Little Round Top to see where Chamberlain made his charge. Well, he was Professor Joshua Chamberlain before he was the colonel of the 20th Maine at Little Round Top. And this is a photograph of him taken sometime in the early 1900s. He had been president of Bowdoin College. And here he's there present as an emeritus in cap and gown. It was Professor Joshua Chamberlain who took a sabbatical to join the U.S. Army and fight in the 20th Maine. And by the time of Gettysburg, he was colonel of the 20th Maine. And they made their famous charge down Little Round Top. He would later receive the Medal of Honor for helping to save the hill. He made that defense with Captain Ellis Spear, Bowdoin class of 1858. Other Bowdoin 20th Mainers that fought at Little Round Top and or fought with the 20th Maine during the war were Captain Lysander Hill, 2nd Lieutenant William Wilson Morrill, 2nd Lieutenant Edward Simonton, and James Henry Maxwell. At Memorial Hall, there are 9 bronze plaques. Over 300 undergraduate alumni from Bowdoin College fought for the Union, with 23 dying in service and 6 receiving the Medal of Honor. Major Generals Oliver O. Howard and Joshua Chamberlain of Bowdoin College are among them. Represented are the 3rd, 4th, 16th, 17th, 19th, and 20th Maine Infantry, 5th Maine Artillery, 32nd, and 33rd Massachusetts. And so Bowdoin College gave at or near the most student soldiers of northern colleges. Here's Joshua Chamberlain with some members of the 20th Maine near their monument on Little Round Top and a post-war reunion. Now, as we enter into our conclusive phase, how did all of this end? Well, it ended badly for a number of southern colleges. You can see VMI was burned by Hunter's raid in the valley in 1864. Some of the colleges were turned into hospitals, which made them badly in need of repair. So many soldiers went off and fought and died or were wounded, had amputations, and the colleges suffered tremendously from finances, from so many people pulling out to go off and fight the war, that some of the colleges didn't survive. Now, VMI would be rebuilt. I mentioned Lynchburg College earlier. It certainly suffered from the war. Here's Old City Cemetery in Lynchburg, Virginia. There are 2,200 Confederate soldiers buried here from 14 states. Lynchburg, Charlottesville, and Richmond's Chimborazo Hospital were the 3 biggest general hospitals in Virginia during the war. So if you were wounded in any number of famous battles in Virginia, you had a 1/3 chance of ending up in Lynchburg. There were rail lines that connected Richmond to Lynchburg to points further south in Georgia and Tennessee. So it was sort of a holding point where a lot of wounded were cared for. And Lynchburg College itself, the first Lynchburg College that preceded any other college in Lynchburg by almost a half a century, that campus became a hospital. It became part of General Hospital number 3. It never recovered. So many soldiers were lost in the war, and there were financial failures by no one there to be able to pay tuition, that it never opened its doors again. Now, on the positive side, colleges had a tremendous upswing. Colleges began to expand after the war, thanks to the Morrill Act of 1862, commonly called the Land Grant Colleges Act, signed by President Lincoln. It was to incentivize the expanding and creation of new colleges. Congress passed this into law to train students in agricultural science and industry. West Point could not handle the engineering needs alone for an expanding country. Employees and companies increasingly needed chemical, civil, structural, and mechanical engineers for the Second Industrial Revolution. Within 41 years, there was a need for aerospace engineers too. If you look back at your alma mater, you'll find oftentimes, don't be surprised if it wasn't founded immediately after the Civil War in the 1860s or 1870s. It's because of the Land Grant College Act. In summary, the college and university soldiers that fought at Gettysburg each represented a youthful exuberance and certain idealism that what they learned in college would define their age. They rushed into the war with a love of their school and an enthusiasm resembling modern-day college athletic rivalries on a Saturday fall afternoon, or March Madness tournaments in the spring. What is so compelling about their story is that this idealism was met with great loss and a large dose of realism. Thank you.